Welcome to It Came from New Jersey, a podcast about music from the great state of New Jersey. I'm one of your two hosts. My name is Bob.
And I'm Pete.
How's it going, Pete? How are you?
Going pretty good. Pretty excited to talk about the record today.
Yeah, me too. We can pretend we didn't just have a really long conversation about laptops, because we're diving into a record that predates laptops by a lot today.
It certainly does, yeah.
So before we get into it, a quick preamble. If you're new to our podcast, welcome. Every episode can be someone's first episode. As I mentioned, the elevator pitch is that we talk about music from the state of New Jersey. The long form is Pete and I have been involved in music for a long time, mostly independent, mostly small stuff, but a lot of it centered around the various types of music that go on in the state of New Jersey. And with that respect, we wanted to explore records, big, small, and otherwise, from New Jersey that we're either intimately familiar with, a little bit familiar with, or completely unfamiliar with. All that said, please check out our other episodes. Have a couple in the bank already. If you're joining us for today's episode, you're in for a treat. This is a record I know pretty well. And despite 23-ish years of friendship with Pete, I don't know that I've ever had a meaningful conversation with him about the Misfits.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I mean, it's kind of a softball for both of us just because we're both so familiar. I think it's definitely the first real softball episode that we've had in terms of, a record that we've heard way more than once, I imagine.
Yes.
So, last week we covered Monster Magnet, Dopes to Infinity. The week before that was Gaslight Anthem 59 Sound. So we've kind of touched on one record that we were both not familiar with at all, and then another album that we, were somewhat familiar with. But this is the first one where I think there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of, kind of perspectives and, opinions that come from different places. It's going to be hard to be objective on this one,
Yes. So when you get into this episode, know that we both have a background in punk music, hardcore punk, the whole thing. And the Misfits are a formative band to that. And I think if you're of a certain age, they're more than formative. They're Mount Rushmore to a lot of people. And so we don't talk about bands in as much as we do when you talk about their records. Today we are discussing the Misfits' Walk Among Us. As Pete mentioned, total softball pitch, but I wanted to kind of bring it to center here on something that we could really sink our teeth into and and to be honest, digest and maybe pick apart in a way that you as a listener don't feel comfortable doing to a record when you listen to it the first and second and third time, or a record that you're familiar with, but it's something that just kind of exists there and you have an affinity for. But the Misfits are a band who, let me just be really clear, I love this record, and I'm not going to be afraid to pull at the strings. And so for people who are listening who are giant Misfits fans, please know that everything said today is done with the biggest love you could imagine. And also saying, hey, even Michael Jordan missed shots. The Misfits are an incredible band. And if it were up to me, this is a record that I would put in almost anyone who likes aggressive music's catalog. But we're going to kind of unravel it in the way that we do. Pete, before we get into today's episode, when is the last time before this exercise, before listening to the record for this episode, did you hear Walk Among Us?
I don't remember exactly, but I have to think it was definitely over 4 or 5 years ago. It's been a long time. And I think the reason for that is not because I don't like the record. Again, like, I'm a huge Misfits fan. They're one of those bands for me that I was so familiar with. Well, I became familiar with at a young age, and as a result, I listened to them, a lot a long time ago, and I'm so familiar with them at this point that I just don't find myself revisiting them all that often. So this, I would say, probably 5 years or so.
It's been less time for me, but that that old glove feeling, that old coat. I actually have a Carhartt jacket, Pete, that I have had since 1995. And I guess I'm proud to admit that it still fits me very well, despite gaining some, at least 75 pounds uh, in the interim. It happens. I'm a tall person though, so thankfully it's not too crazy. But the jacket still fits me. I retired it probably 12 or 14 years ago, and it became solely used as the jacket I wear when I'm carrying our Christmas tree into the house and our Christmas tree out of the house, because it's got it's a Carhartt thick, heavy weave jacket, so that now it's a little snug, but it still fits, still zips, the whole thing. But I can wear it, get covered if there's pine needles, if there's any sort of sap, any goo. I don't care if it gets on this jacket. I love the jacket, but it's got one use. Misfits Walk Among Us is more than a one-trick pony, but it does feel like that. I probably listen to the record once a year, maybe more frequently. And to be honest, when I sat with it here, I was like, yeah, I love this record in a way that I should probably pull it out more often. And I think that it deserves a lot of attention, maybe more than it gets right now.
Yeah, I mean that's actually part of what I'm curious about is, and I think we'll get into it maybe later, but how much the Misfits, are actually, a band that people like, a gateway band at this point. But I wanted to kick it off real quick. Do you remember the first time you heard the Misfits, or do you have any recollection of that?
I do. I actually remember it very specifically. I heard, there's two really quick intro stories on that. I heard the song Skulls being played in a friend's car, and they were already into punk, and I wasn't. I was just getting into things, but I remember a lot of the stuff they listened to was a little more aggressive, and more. And aggressive is such a fun word to use because it's a bit ambiguous though here. It was less tuneful, and it was more severe and kind of caustic to the ears. So when on the mixtape the Misfits came on, Skulls, as someone who wasn't really entrenched in that kind of like super aggressive, hyper fast, hard music, when the Misfits come on, it was like a different thing. It's very tuneful, and it's got the same, I want your skull, and it stuck like immediately. It was like, oh, this is one of the first punk songs I love. Yeah. So that was like one of the earliest memories. And then fast forward, not a year probably, but maybe it could have been as few as a few months. But when you're young, months feel like years sometimes. And on my cross country team was an older guy. He was a senior and I was a freshman, named Blaze. And I'll redact his last name for privacy's sake. And he was a huge Misfits fan. He was a kind of nutty dude, but he loved the Misfits, and he eventually became, at the very least, an acquaintance, but probably a friend, I would say. And he would start our cross country meets by screaming the lyrics to Misfits songs, like as he's like. And so cross country, for those who are unfamiliar, is distance running. It's essentially a 5K race for the typical one, 3.1 miles. And so when you start running cross country, you're told right away, like, you don't sprint at the beginning. You want to sprint at the end. But you don't want to sprint at the beginning because you're not going to have the energy. However, when you all line up on a line, it is very hard not to want to sprint. And this dude would sprint every time, and he'd be screaming Misfits lyrics to himself, basically. And I think it drove the cross country coach up a wall and made him crazy, but it worked for him. And I just remember that. That's like one of those like indelible memories of like, what is going on?
That's an aggressive thing to do. That'll definitely get everybody ramped up.
Get them pumped. So yeah, those are my two memories: skulls and running cross country. What about you?
I don't actually remember the first time. I have to think that it was probably on a skate video or something.
Right.
We're one of those bands that, you know, I'm not ashamed. I definitely got into punk rock through Green Day and a lot of things that were happening at the time.
Sure.
But one of my friends must have had a Misfits CD, and it was just one of those things that was on all the time. But I think the funny part about it is, I think it has to have been Walk Among Us or one of the collection albums.
Right, which were very big.
Yeah, that I heard the most. But then American Psycho came out like right around then. So I remember kind of listening to the two interchangeably, and like honestly at that point I didn't have the ear. I was just like, I guess, they've just been playing for 20 years or something. And I think I preferred American Psycho at the time, which I definitely don't anymore. I have revisited it, and it doesn't stand up all that well to me. But it was one of those things where I saw the Misfits a year ago when they played in Newark, and I have to say that I enjoyed seeing them in 1997 at the Birch Hill with Michael Graves singing more than I did when I saw them last year.
So let's unpack that for a second. What do you think it was?
I mean, for me, it was, being a kid, being excited about it. Really, like, I had no interest in whether it was Danzig or who was singing it. Like, none of that mattered to me. It was just a matter of, hearing those songs being played. It just felt like the energy was there. I remember the crowd was super psyched. I think it was Misfits, Sick of It All, and H2O.
That sounds right. Yep.
And that was actually, a whole other conversation where, I was getting into those bands at the time as well.
For sure.
Whereas the show last year, the sound was terrible. And B,
I heard that, which is wild. So I'm sorry, continue.
No, yeah. The sound was bad, but then it was also just, listen, if I was in a situation like Danzig or any of, Doyle or any of those guys are, I would play all of the Misfits shows I could, like, why not?
Yes.
You built the band, there's demand, play the shows. A lot of people had a lot of great times. I heard the Madison Square Garden show was fantastic. I've no beef with the whole thing, but it was really obvious to me that the only person that knew what was happening at any given point on stage was Dave Lombardo, who was playing drums. So, if you know the Misfits and know the members, he is not one of the original members. He was one of the guys that got pulled in for that show, and everyone else, there were flubs kind of all over the place. The sound was off. There were certain points where you really couldn't tell what song they were playing, which is, tough with Misfits because most of the songs are so iconic. You know them front to back. But not only did the crowd not know until they really got to the chorus, but the band didn't seem to know. So it was just the spirit wasn't there for me. The energy wasn't there for me. It was not a great experience. I have much fonder memories of seeing them, in the late 90s.
Yeah. Well, so you hit the right point. First is the experience. It's very hard to explain until you're there, and when you are there, you really understand it. The excitement and newness of things when you're a kid can't be understated. That's not to say you can't have incredible show going and live event experiences as an adult, it's just different. It's like eating your favorite dinner the first time or the second time you discover a new restaurant and you go and you're like, oh my God, this is incredible. There's the first time where it's that magic of this is new. I love it. I just discovered it. Then there's the, I like this so much. I can't wait to go again. And after about the 20th time, and it's now just a part of your routine, you might not take it for granted. You might still love it. You might still really enjoy it. You might still crave it, but it's not the same. So, so I think that is one part of it. And yeah, I did not go to see the Misfits at the Newark show or the Madison Square Garden show, and I had the opportunity. A friend actually gave me a chance to go, and they had a whole setup in one of the suites, and I really should have, but I had the inkling that I'd probably get another chance, and I just don't know. It's sort of the question of, do I think I want to see that band in that experience? And we're talking mighty familiar about the Misfits, and that's okay because we are, but I do want to pull this out because there could be someone out there listening who's completely unfamiliar with this band. So let's clear up the table here. We're going to tidy our papers and give you a little background on the Misfits, because you might have heard us throw out a bunch of names and you'd be like, wait, who, what, where? The Misfits are a really early first wave punk band from Lodi, New Jersey. And, their first single came out in 1977, Cough Cool, I believe.
Yeah.
And members of the band are Glenn Danzig, who, is primarily associated with this band, and then his eponymously named solo act Danzig, but not a solo act, but named the band after himself. And he also did a band called Samhain in the middle. Jerry Only, who has pretty consistently done the Misfits after a short break through the mid and late 80s, brought it back in the late 90s with a variety of different singers. And Doyle. Is Doyle Jerry Only's brother? Am I correct about that?
That's actually a good question. I don't think so.
I don't remember. Yeah, no. Well, Doyle, and there was. Am I forgetting someone? Danzig, Doyle.
No, you're right. Jerry Only's brother is Doyle. Yeah.
Okay, so there you go. So these dudes started this band. They musical style speaking broadly, so we can set the table. Punk, but with a real kind of appreciation for American rock a la Elvis.
Yeah.
And
I think Danzig's the influence, especially now, Danzig just recently put out an album of Elvis songs, but I think, you listen to his voice and the Elvis influence is definitely there.
Right. And so, these guys are coming right in the wake of the Ramones and all that stuff, but they start very small. They release their own records, They get more entrenched primarily with this, like, the DIY punk and hardcore world, who really embraces them and loves them, despite the fact, and I think there was some mutual appreciation. I think at least a couple of these guys were into that first wave of American hardcore or punk rock stuff, but they were always a little different. These dudes from day one were wearing makeup, and that was so interesting because it's antecedent to a lot of the other with the bands they were playing with. You talk about Black Flag, and that's a band who was getting on stage in street clothes. The clothes they wore, put on when they woke up in the morning, were the ones they wore on stage later that night. With the Misfits, that was a little different, and they were always more into the performative elements, and somehow it all worked, which is kind of magical and cool and weird all at the same time. They break up in, I don't know, 83?
I think it was 83.
Right. Walk Among Us is a proper studio album that came out in 1982. and that's where we're kind of going to get into any other news or notes. The Misfits are also very famous because of a lot of internal squabbles, because their imagery is iconic. The Crimson Ghost figure, I'm certain that even if you are completely unfamiliar with their music, if you saw this image, you'd go, I saw that shirt on someone here, there, or anywhere. And because they became so famous, they were bootlegged, their merchandise had true value, all this type of thing. And so that led to infighting in the band, lots of litigation, who owned what, who wrote what, bop, bop, bop. And up until, what was that, 3 years ago? 4 years ago? Something like that?
When they started playing?
Yeah, when they started playing with Glenn
With
Danzig.
Yeah, I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago.
Danzig refused to have anything to do with the Misfits, other than when he would do his concerts, his band would perform a couple songs here or there as they chose. And the other members had a version of the Misfits that, as Pete noted, they had a singer who was the first replacement for Glenn Danzig, Michael Graves, who did the band for a while. And after him, it was essentially kind of a rotating cast of characters, where they had everyone from one of the Ramones singing to a fella named Zoli Teglas, who sang in a hardcore punk band named Ignite, who's very notable because he had a very operatic voice. So putting him in the shoes was very interesting. And I mean, and there's probably at least a handful more who were regular assignment singers for this band, the Misfits, including times where Jerry Only would just sing all the songs. And as far as I know, they were still, making returns as a touring act through that time frame,
Yeah. Yeah, I think Doyle was doing some solo stuff here and there, but the Misfits were pretty much always playing in some capacity. So
let's get into the meat of what we're here to talk about, which is the record Walk Among Us. Pete, as you established, it had been a while since you heard it. For me, it had been a while. Was there anything in your head, any preconceived notions or thoughts about this record leading into it, being that it had been a while since you listened?
So this was always one of my go-tos. It was I would either, if I was going to listen to the Misfits, I'd either listen to this or Collection 1 or Collection 2. And the collection albums are not exactly, collections of their singles. I think a lot of them are re-recordings.
Right.
But essentially it's just singles collections.
Yes.
So, I was excited to listen to it. I knew that, I liked it. I just wanted to kind of go in with fresh ears and, see what I thought about it. Yeah.
Yeah. For me, not much. This is my favorite Misfits record. And I wanted to frame it like, as I mentioned at the top, are there things I can look for on this record and kind of pick at? Which seems tough, but we're treating Walk Among Us like the prized student in a classroom, that you need to push him because he's so good, Yeah. So we're gonna correct all the grammar and really go into it.
I did want to think about too, while I was listening to it, like what else was actually happening at the time, because it's one of those albums that I listened to. I've just listened to for so long that it doesn't really have much of a context for me. I guess I should say historical context, because for me it's just kind of one of those things that's always been there.
Yeah.
So I wanted to look at like what other albums were coming out at the time and things like that. I mean, you mentioned, not to get into it too much, but you mentioned the face paint before and kind of the theatricality of it all. And, that was like a really, really new thing at the time. I mean, the only band really doing that was Kiss, but obviously they were operating in a different lane than Kiss. Right. So,
yes.
You think of bands like, there's a punk band called TSOL. There's another band called Christian Death. And, they're all pretty influential bands now, but at the time they were kind of riding on that Misfits vibe. And Misfits were kind of the originators I guess if we're not giving it to Kiss, because maybe Kiss are the originators, but
we might need to give it to Kiss. However, the Misfits really took it out of the arena, and I think that's important. Taking it out of the arena and putting it in a place where you can touch it and feel it, I think set the stage in a different way for how music can be performative and artistic in even in a small sense, even in a way that you can reach out and touch it. Because with Kiss, yeah, they were larger than life, and that's part of their whole appeal. And I could really, if somebody wants to talk to me about Kiss Alive 2, we could really go in on that for a while. But it was on a giant stage in a giant stadium, and it always has been, and it was meant to be. You know what I mean? Like, if somebody wants to tell me about the earliest Kiss shows in mid-sized venues, okay, that's neat. But to be honest, if I want to see Kiss, I want to see them in a stadium. And that's sort of, that kind of goes full circle to this idea of like the Misfits, however, I'd rather see in a club.
Yeah.
I'd want them in full paint, but seeing them in a stadium or an arena was kind of the pushback. Like, is this the way I want to experience this?
It's a completely different energy. I mean, although the aesthetics might be like a little bit similar, Kiss are singing about cold gin and the Misfits are singing about going out and killing, so I mean,
yes.
it couldn't be more different, really.
Right. So I think it's important to note that was such a great question, because I've never put, and I like to look at things historically, but I've never put where Walk Among Us fits into the register and where it fits into how things go. Comes out in 1982 on Ruby Records, which is also a part of Slash Records. Slash Records, for people who don't know, was a big label that eventually gets acquired by Warner Brothers, but put out a lot of early punk and then moving on like odd alternative music. So everything from releasing the first Germs record and X Los Angeles to putting out records for Violent Femmes and Los Lobos and stuff like that much later on. When we're talking about 1982, some of the other records that came out on Slash include, and I thought this was really interesting, Fear the Record, pretty big one in the punk world, Gun Club, Fire of Love, and Dream Syndicate, The Days of Wine and Roses. I'm not familiar with that one, and the XLP Wild Gift. So Walk Among Us and the Fear record, I can actually see parallels. I for who they are and how this comes out, it's sort of interesting because it's such a monolith to someone who's into punk music, but in reality, this is a small release. This is not a huge major label like roll out, like check it out.
Right.
They were originally planning to release this in 81 on their own label, but couldn't. And this is, you can pull this and read the Wikipedia stuff for yourself at some point. But they do, and it did pretty well. But pretty well at that time is 20,000 copies. So for the punk world, that's a lot. For anything else, that's okay.
Yeah. And it's funny you said 20,000. I was actually just reading about that. I read that Danzig claims that it sold 20,000, but apparently one of the record execs of Slash at the time said all the records that were coming out at that time sold around like 25,000 or 2,500 to like 7,000 max. So like that number could be wildly inflated.
Right. And that's the part that's interesting, is that for some of these early punk records, and I'll cite Black Flag Damage as another example, some of the Danger House records, Circle Jerks records, stuff like that, 20 to 25,000 is like this weird 15, 20, 25,000 is this weird magic number that kind of gets tossed out. And why that's important, it's sort of like, well, who's going to check you on that? It's like telling stories that like no one can totally confirm or deny, but people can speculate about. And it's like, well, that doesn't sound real, but it's also not so crazy that it's not so crazy that it's a lie worth telling. So if it's a makeup number, great. If it's not, great.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, the Misfits are so iconic that it sounds like a really low number, you know?
Yeah. So when it gets to the music, how would you describe Misfits Walk Among Us to someone who had never heard it?
It's really, really driving. It is, I would say it's like the most relentless music that you're going to listen to that is still really catchy and sing-alongy. You know, I forgot that 20 Eyes was the first song, and it just like how aggressively the record kicks in.
Yes.
It's really like it still sounds really edgy. It's still like the record sounds great. But you know, there's still a lot of woes. There's a lot of hooks. They definitely, I think, probably wanted everybody to be singing all the lyrics along with them. You know, it's like the songs seem like they were built to have sing-alongs too. So, but at the same time, it's really dark. There's a lot of the lyrics evoke, you know, like a lot of dark imagery. A lot of it's taken from, I think, like 50s and 60s horror films mostly.
Yes.
So it's like, I don't know. The short version is like horror movie influenced aggressive punk rock.
Yeah, and yes, and it is driving. The speed is mid-tempo to fast, but it, you know, in the register of someone who's more, you wouldn't call this fast to anyone who's familiar with metal or punk music in the modern sense, right? Like it's fast compared to a lot of things, but you know, it's not racing. It's not, there's no just unbelievably fast, you know, BPM.
I'll say this though, like the sorry to cut you off, but the energy there, like it's not as fast as metal. It's not as fast as, you know, a lot of punk rock now. It definitely isn't. It's certainly mid tempo in comparison to all that stuff. But I think the energy that they play they play the songs at, it's like they are definitely playing as fast and as hard as they know how to. And you can kind of feel that through the record. And that's,
that reverberates that like you pulsate.
Yeah, that's the effective part to me.
That's really well put. I didn't think about that. That might be if I put my head to it, I think describing this record as energetic, vibrant, dark punk. You know what I mean? Because its lyrical content is pretty funny. It actually is toned down from the singles. I was thinking about that because I was like, ooh. Now, and I should say it's toned down and give you a sampling of the song "Mommy, Can I Go Out and Kill Tonight?" Singled out the kids who are mean to me. Get straight A's, but they still make fun. I don't give a. I'll laugh last. Stayed in every night. Do my homework so I'll be smart. Girls all say I'm a little fucked. Mommy, I'm a good boy. Mommy, I'm a fucking savior. Mommy, I'm alive. Mommy, can I go out and kill tonight? Rip the veins from human necks until they're wet with life. Razor blades love teenage flesh. An epidermody. I'll bring back a souvenir for it's my mommy's dream. Can I go out and kill tonight? Kill tonight. That is the toned down lyrics for the Misfits. And do you think that could fly in the current, you know, for lack of a better term, the current climate?
No, I'm not sure it could.
Now, how about this one? Let me give you this, and then I want to hear you. The song "Bullet," and this is the one I was thinking of because "Bullet" is the second single by the Misfits, and you'll probably be able to get what the song's about. Man, are we gonna have to have like a parental advisory sticker on this podcast?
I know we might. Yeah.
President's bullet-ridden body in the street. Ride, Johnny, ride. Kennedy's shattered head hits concrete. Ride, Johnny, ride. Johnny's wife is floundering. Johnny's wife is scared. Run, Jackie, run. Texas is an outrage when your husband is dead. Texas is an outrage when they pick up his head. Texas is the reason that the president's dead. You gotta suck, Jackie, suck. So, and it goes beyond that. I'll stop right there. Let me put it out there. I love this song. I, again, love the Misfits. Lyrically, this is pushing the limit in a way that bands today wouldn't dare.
This is like Cannibal Corpse territory. It's like the deepest of like death metal, you know?
Right. And I say that not just speaking really broadly in the way that we have so far talked about kind of different records in this realm, and we'll probably eventually hit a Bruce Springsteen record in here. But this is something that even underground punk and hardcore bands don't tread into this level of conversation today. And oftentimes you see lyrical content kind of progress and change and push boundaries. And yeah, outside of like true like death metal or like the most edgy of like intentionally edgy, not like, hey, we're writing this song and this, you know, Bullet is a staple of the Misfits collection. You know, yeah. This is not some throwaway track. This is a popular Misfits song, and those lyrics are scalding. So it's interesting to see how they kind of really push the limits lyrically. And as far as the music, it really is. It's driving, it's pulsating. Can I say this? I think discovering the Misfits before the Ramones made it harder for me to appreciate the Ramones.
Sure. That actually makes sense. I mean, it's much more, it's an entirely different energy. I mean, Ramones feel like Disney World compared to this.
Yeah. And, you know, that isn't to say the Ramones don't have a lot of merit. The Ramones are an important band, a cool band, whatever. But when I was working my way as a young person in music, I was like, okay, the Ramones are neat. This is like nifty. But what I want, I looked at that energy that the Misfits brought, specifically on Walk Among Us, and was like, they're tuneful. They're, you know, these are songs that get stuck in my head. It's relatively simple music, like, you know, the 3 chords type thing. It's pretty simple, but it's just so much. It's just, the music rips out of the record at you. And I don't get that sensation from many records, and I still get that from Walk Among Us. Yeah, certainly.
If we want to jump back into kind of the history really quick.
Please.
So I guess full context, you know, one of the reasons I like doing this podcast and wanted to do this was because I always like, you know, thinking about the history of albums and where they came from and like who was involved and all that stuff. So the Misfits historically for me have always been tough when I think of it in that context because their discography is like impossible to follow.
Yes.
You know, there's singles and then there's albums, but then there's albums that were recorded but never released. And then there were albums that were recorded and not released until, you know, 20 years later. And it's just, you know, and then there's singles collection where the actual singles are re-recorded, you know, so they've always been like tough for me and annoying in that way. But that being said, I actually didn't know that there were 2 albums recorded before this. I knew there was one. So Static Age was recorded and they recorded 12 Hits from Hell. So Walk Among Us was recorded between 81 and the very, very beginning of 82. But there were 2 albums before that. Static Age was finally released in 1996. 12 Hits from Hell has never actually had an official release, although you can find bootlegs of it pretty easily. So I knew about Static Age because that came out around the time that I was getting into the Misfits. Yeah. But I actually wasn't even aware of 12 Hits from Hell until a few years ago, honestly. So a lot of music there. And it's interesting to me that they recorded 2 full albums before this, but yet this album is kind of a Frankenstein of an album. I mean, there's a live track on it. You know, not everything was recorded in the same place, although I think most of it was. It's interesting that, given all of the recordings that they did for this, that they ended up with this.
Right. On a purely sound, like sonic view, are there things about this recording that you would change, or that you think could be quote unquote better? The one thing I will say is this record certainly sounds of its time. It's not a particularly clean recording. It's pretty dirty's not the right word, but there's a fuzz to it, and it works. And I feel like part of that is intentional because that's sort of the sound they're going for. But if you were to listen to a Ramones record from this time, it's not nearly as buzzsaw as this record.
Right. Yeah, it definitely has a much more aggressive energy than all of that stuff. Although, one of the things I was thinking about, and this is kind of, maybe it's the wrong time to ask the question, but
No.
Just to bring it out, do you think that the Misfits, obviously they fell into the punk scene, punk hardcore scene, that's where they ended up playing, but do you think that's actually where they wanted to be? Or do you think that they, had their gaze set on much grander ambitions and kind of ended up fitting into the punk scene, and that's, just kind of where it landed? Because I really don't know. Like I get the sense that I don't know. I get the sense that they could have been involved in punk, but they could have been involved in, just like the New York City rock and roll bar scene, and they would have been just as happy.
Yeah, I think purely speculative, and I'm sure there are Misfits diehards who could give us a much better look into this. But the way I always felt about it, and the way I always saw it, and it's kind of why I appreciate the Misfits as this singular entity, was that they liked where they were. They appreciated it. They loved the energy because it's perhaps the only rooms they could find that matched their energy were other, bands in the hardcore and punk scene. And if you listen to their other records, if you listen to the record Earth AD, that's a much faster record. It's not thrash, because when I think of thrash, I think of more metal leaning guitars, but it's a very fast punk record. It's a blazing fast punk record.
Right.
So I think they ended up leaning that way sonically, but I think they would have been happy if you had told the Misfits, and this is perhaps what sets them apart, hey, you're going to play 3,000 capacity venues across the US and sell them out, and then you're going to move up and start playing small arenas, and you're going to go tour with Kiss. There is no part of me that thinks they would say no.
Right.
I don't think that wasn't success to them was success. They thought, oh, we can do this band and we won't work odd job construction in North Jersey.
Right.
That's great. Fantastic. We'll do that. All that said, that is one of these weird separators, because the Misfits were a very DIY operation. They were releasing their own records. They had their own fan club that they ran. They did all these little things, and they were, from what I understand, it was all done by them. But and then Walk Among Us comes out on Slash, which is, on Ruby, which is an imprint of Slash, which is notably a bigger record. But if they had the opportunity to sign to Elektra or Atlantic or Warner Brothers, I'm sure they would have considered that. As you can see, where Danzig went, that he went major label and ended up being quite successful for a long time.
Right.
So the question being, did they just kind of end up in the more hardcore punk world, this world that's a little bit more DIY by nature, almost in spite of and in the face of trying to do things for financial or monetary success? Absolutely. But somehow it worked. And that's one of the miracles of this band that's most impressive, is that they were odd ducks.
Yeah.
and were revered. These they were seen as formative to the sound, and I don't know. I don't know that they get credit for that energy and influence they had on the first wave of American hardcore.
Yeah, for sure.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, absolutely. I listened to the album and I thought to myself, like, kind of going back to my point about how it sounds like they're doing the best they can, and like really pushing it. Like,
right.
they could definitely write a hook. They could definitely write a song. Like, these songs are like, obviously, pantheon punk rock songs. But that being said, like, it just sounds like they're pushing in a way that they want it to be like advanced, and it's just like it hasn't gotten to the point that they, like, as players, are capable of getting, like I don't know. I think about how much like Metallica are influenced by the Misfits. They kind of like wear that on their sleeve, not so much in their sound. Like, they wear the shirts and all this stuff.
They wear the shirts, they do the covers, right? For sure.
Yeah. And like, I think to myself, like, like the Misfits probably like wanted to be doing like more technical stuff, but like, you listen to the drummer and like the drums are great. They're great punk rock drums, but and the guitars are too, but like those dudes weren't like the best in the biz, when it came to like actually like their chops,
No.
in fact, like one of the reasons I got into playing music was because I listened to the Misfits and I was like, as like a 12-year-old kid, I was like, I think I can like probably figure that out.
Right. I can do this.
Yeah. That's a whole other level, but
of the influence. No, I mean, what you felt at 12 is something that, wow, I wonder about that influence because of the aptitude that they showed, which is, let's spade a spade. Outside of Glenn Danzig as a vocalist, and let's put a pin in that, they aren't remarkable players except for with the energy they play.
Yeah.
They're pounding their instruments. They're beating them up. They're playing as hard as they can, and that is important. And I think it doesn't get the due credit or respect it deserves. Now, I say that, and they sell out arenas, and they sold out Madison Square Garden, so it's not like they haven't gotten some respect. But in conversations about influential early American punk and hardcore bands, they might get left off that note just because their star rose so high. With that said, are you pro Glenn Danzig vocals, anti, or somewhere in the middle?
In terms of like what now?
Now, then, forever. If that's changed, go through your journey.
I mean, I'm definitely pro, I guess. I mean, like my favorite Misfits records are the ones with Glenn Danzig. I think his voice really works for that music. I think I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that he was like more or less the visionary behind the whole thing. So to me, like the Misfits, it's not really the same without him. I don't know that, like, 2018 to 2020 Misfits notwithstanding, like
sure.
we can even pretend that doesn't exist. Like, I just think that you get a different energy from the original Misfits than you do with, American Psycho and Famous Monsters and all of that stuff. So yeah, I guess I'm pro. He definitely had a vision, and he definitely contributed like massively, to the band. So I have to say I'm pro.
I'm pro his vocals through all his material. I like him in Danzig. He has a unique voice. He's going for Elvis, but also in an aggressive way. And man, if anyone who's listening to this, whether you're a really big Misfits fan or you like the band but you haven't dug into things, or you're really not, I'd like you to listen to the records. This one specifically, Walk Among Us. Hear his vocals. Maybe go check out one of the Danzig records. Hear his voice. He's got chops. He can sing. And then I would like you to hear a clip of him speaking. because he's not Sylvester Stallone, but he's the North Jersey version of that, and he's kind of got this like talking like a guy who grew up in North Jersey in the 70s.
Yeah.
And he's got a real good attitude about it. He's got some fucking attitude, and it's really amazing to hear the chops from that dude. So if you aren't a singer, maybe this is your inspiration as well to go, maybe I can do that. He's got a great voice and he's pulling from unique wells. I think one of the other parts that really makes the Misfits stick out, we reference the lyrics, the content as being kind of salacious and shocking and extreme, but they also are very unique. And in the way that they were taking themes and following those themes and singing about these influences of horror movies and sci-fi movies, they opened up this world of appreciation for that in a different way. It's not total homage, but it's pretty close. And in the same way as I'm saying, hey, let's put some respect on the name of the Misfits towards their influence on the first wave American punk, hardcore, and DIY nature. Two, they opened up this world of horror and sci-fi. Not that they were the only ones doing it. I'm sure there were people doing newsletters, but these guys were putting out songs about horror movies and sci-fi films that were kind of cultish. So they kind of struck into this really interesting vein and kind of the Venn diagram of people into punk music and into horror and sci-fi in a real heavy way intersects perfectly at where the Misfits are.
Yeah, definitely. They like created their own niche in a way that's so interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's gone away. You know, I mean, like My Chemical Romance, for example, that's actually an album that I want to touch on at some point because I've never heard them. But
yes,
just aesthetically, you can tell there's like an obvious Misfits influence, right?
Absolutely. Oh, like the updated version, perhaps. And
Right.
we do have to talk about them.
Yeah.
So is there anything you would change on Walk Among Us?
So I don't really think so, actually. I honestly had forgotten that Mommy Can I Go Out and Kill Tonight was a live track.
Yep.
And I couldn't really find an answer in my research for like why that was. It just kind of seems like that was probably the best version at the time that they had. And, they decided to put that on because they liked the track.
Yep.
Which is cool. I mean, again, it sounds great. I don't think it takes anything away from the record. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I think that it's like almost a 5 out of 5 punk record in the way that like the energy's there. They're playing their asses off. Like you said, I mean, like that DIY spirit, like they, were one of the forebearers of that stuff. I don't know. Like every track is a hit.
Well, I agree. The only one I would say, Brain Eaters, is the one I would go, maybe I could cut this. However,
that was my next comment, actually. Yeah, because that's the one song that I didn't really remember being on the record, probably because I never cared.
Never cared. However, I want to say there is a certain charm to a song like that. It is silly. It is playful. It is a closer that they don't take themselves too serious, and in a world that quite often takes itself too serious, having a song that makes your simple, otherwise speaking songs look like calculus. Closing your record with brains for dinner, brains for lunch, brains for breakfast, brains for brunch, brains at every single meal. Why can't we have some guts? Oi, oi.
See, but that's the one. That's where, to me, it's like,
cut it. You're like, cut it.
Yeah, like it sounds like they all got hammered and like had a party in the studio, and like that's something you can like save for yourselves, Like,
okay, so if we have to vote, I guess we're gonna vote Brain Eaters off. However, I bet there's some giant Misfits fan who's listening and is very upset at us. And to
It's
you,
it,
I apologize, but
it's probably a great track to like close the bar out to. I don't know, but like
yeah, I can go. I can get better pub rock
yeah,
around town.
exactly,
So
exactly.
Otherwise, it's a 13 song, including Brain Eaters, 24-minute, 38-second record. If we take out Brain Eaters, which is 56 seconds, and take out the Mommy Can I Go Out and Kill Tonight live, we're talking about an 11 song, 21 and a half minute record. That's nuts. Most of these songs clip by. And that's something I also think is really noteworthy about talented punk bands that have a sense of melody to their songs, is the ability to capture a melody and make a memorable song in under 2 minutes. And almost all of these Misfit songs, 20 Eyes, I Turn Into a Martian, All Hell Breaks Loose, Vampira, are under a minute or under 2 minutes. Violent World, Devil's Whorehouse, Astro Zombies is 2:14. But all these songs are clipping in between a minute 30 and 2:15. That's impressive. Hate Breeders is the song that's the longest, and that's just over 3 minutes. So
Yeah,
there's something about this record it's very easy to digest, even if you weren't a punk super fan. So if you're someone who's more into rock, or you're more into indie, or you're just not familiar with this at all, but you're curious, I would actually recommend this as a door opener punk record for someone of any age.
yeah, absolutely. Real quick, if given the option, would you take out Mommy? The live
No, I would not. I would not, because the energy on it fits with the record, and it sets this weird tone. Coming to this from being an early punk record I owned, it set the table for me being like, oh wait, what? This is they're putting a song played live, not like a studio song on here. So no, I think it adds to the record. What about you?
I definitely wouldn't, but I was listening to it. I actually listened to it again right before we recorded right now, and dude, like the bass drops out. Like it's not even a good performance, But like that being said, like again, it gets back to the energy where it's really hard to do that, and I think that we need to appreciate like bands like that don't come around every day where you can record like a super sloppy live version and it's like actually the like definitive version,
Yes. Yeah. So I said, yeah, I agree with that strongly. This is a punk record that I would also put it this way, and I hadn't thought of it till we were talking about this and simple songs, and there's this Elvis reference. They're using source material of like 50s and maybe early 60s simple melodic rock and roll songs, but let's click the speed up, double speed, and make it feel aggressive and violent almost, but still have that tunefulness. So even if there's an abrasion to the content, I feel like there's at least 3 songs on this record that would get stuck in almost anyone's head. Now, that said, how has this record aged? Is this a record that you think being played to someone who's young in 2020, someone under 25, is this a record you think they could appreciate, enjoy, and really come to love as their own, like say you or I have?
Yeah. I have a lot of feelings on that, and I'm not sure exactly where I land. But so, when I saw them in Newark last year or 2 years ago, whatever it was, I didn't particularly enjoy it. It was fine, whatever. That being said, there were a lot of parents there with kids, and they were having a fantastic time. So in that way, I think that they're one of those bands that parents are passing down to their kids. Like my dad was like, "Hey, I'm going to bring you to see Yes," and like there are some cooler dads who are like, "Hey, I'm going to bring you to see the Misfits."
Right.
So um,
That's arguable. It's just depending on your perspective, right?
yeah, no, sure, but like um, the energy's still there. I think if you have someone there to show it to you. Um, at the same time, is it one of those things that you can kind of find on your own, that might get you into subculture in some way? Like, I honestly don't know. And, one of the things I thought about was that, um, I collect records. I'm on some message boards, with people talking about, new vinyl that's coming out or like, reissues. And recently, maybe a year ago, there was a reissues of the Famous Monsters LP, which is
Mm-hmm.
one of the, I think it's the second kind of comeback album from the late 90s.
Yes.
Apparently, that on vinyl was like a $200 record, and people were thrilled that it was getting reissued. And I thought to myself, like, because personally, I've never heard that album. I kind of dropped off at that point.
Sure.
But there were a lot of people who were really, really excited for it. And I thought to myself, like, that was potentially the first Misfits album that a lot of people heard. Like, that was their gateway. And like, there's probably a lot of people who prefer, American Psycho, Famous Monsters era to any of the early stuff, like.
Let me confirm that for you, which is a bit of it was a bit of surprise to me. And it's people who are maybe just under your age range, Pete. People who got into the Misfits maybe 3-4 years after us, or say in the early 2000s. When they went back, the records they were hearing were Famous Monsters and American Psycho. And the appreciation for those records in the past 5 to 8 years that I've noticed is it was very surprising to me, because those records, let's be fair, they were sort of admonished and kind of dismissed as that's not the real Misfits. Right. That's not Glenn Danzig. And it forced me to go, because I had sat with that. I had heard those records probably once when they each came out, and that was it for me. But when, and I was young, so it was easy to dismiss things, and I still had a lot of music to discover. But when I started hearing people really talk up these Michael Graves Misfits records, I was like, okay, let me give it a try. And I don't feel that kind of love for them, but there's a couple songs that I'm like, okay, I get it, but it doesn't. What those records really lack is this raw, fervent energy that is kind of that we keep circling around and going back to and saying, look, you just can't recreate this kind of energy by force. This is something that happens, and sometimes bands capture it and sometimes they just don't. And Walk Among Us has it in spades.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
On a purely production level, I don't know. I hear from people on each side of the fence that sometimes, I've heard from some people that they can't listen to old music that doesn't have a certain production quality, and that's okay. But I think this is a pretty timeless record. That said,
I mean, no, go ahead. Sorry.
No, please.
I was just gonna say. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, for me, like a lot of the early punk albums that I got into initially, they sound like this. So to my ear, it's fine, but I imagine, going along with the Famous Monsters, American Psycho, era people, I can totally see how, that kind of newer production value, which I guess at this point is 20 years old, but it still sounds a lot fresher, I think, than Walk Among Us.
For sure.
How people could get in there and, not be as excited by the older stuff. So,
yes. And so I think you asked a really great question at the beginning of the episode. I think we should circle into that, as it kind of segues into this really well.
Yeah. So, are the Misfits still a gateway band? Because they were so obviously a gateway band for me. They led me to Black Flag and, just all of these other kind of critical punk bands of the time and of the era. And I just don't know, I'm full disclosure, I'm 35 years old. I, at this point, don't really know where, if people are getting into punk rock, what the gateway is, because, quite honestly, like, I think of Famous Monsters being a gateway album, and I have to imagine, like, maybe that's not one either, like maybe the Misfits are just an iconic logo at this point. I honestly have no idea.
I think exactly the same. What I will say is I have a definite opinion on it. I don't believe they are. I think that they can be, but you made this really great point, and it's sort of like I often think of bands as having different life cycles and different waves in popularity and rises and falls in terms of cycling in and out of pop culture or popularity in subculture for that matter. You gave the example of getting into punk music through Green Day, and I think it's important for people to note that, in the mid 90s, early mid 90s, there was grunge and alternative, and that was sort of how I got into it. And immediately following that, and kind of adjacent to it at the end of it, was this weird little rise of punk music where Green Day hits big, and then Rancid and The Offspring also do, and those are all varying levels of, quote unquote credibility punk music. And so, that's a longer conversation we can have, blah, blah, blah. That's not really what it's about. What it's about is the sonic nature of it. That whole wave of bands, and if you want to also include the rise of heavy metal, which, starts in the mid 80s, early mid 80s, and continues, Metallica was always wearing the Misfits on their sleeve as, hey, this is a band you need to know. I'm not sure that young people think they need to know Metallica at this point.
Right.
Or use that as a go-to, like, hey, I'm going to check out this Metallica band. What's this all about? Green Day, Rancid, The Offspring, they made it a really easy sonic jump over to the Misfits, who then make it an easy jump over to several other more underground punk hardcore bands, or that whole world. I don't see sonic analogs to that, in mainstream punk music. And there's some of it, but you start to have to you need something in between that pop culture relevant band, and then you need one other band to be a step to the Misfits at this point. So I think that takes them away. They're still, I said they're a door opener band because their sound is a bit accessible and it's tuneful and a little easier to palate than some things. But right now, I don't know, like, there's people who still check out, the new Blink-182 record, but that's a shrinking population. So what are the big bands who you could say, hey, I could see someone checking this out, and then they'd be able to step over into the Misfits?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that the Misfits at this point, their influence is so baked in to, like, all, not even just subculture, like all music, I think. Blink-182, like, still a huge band,
Absolutely.
And, they have an obvious influence, but, things like the biggest subcultural bands, like, like, let's talk about, like, Morbid Angel for death metal,
Sure.
and, like, My Chemical Romance, who, like, just got off this big reunion tip. Like,
that's right.
All of those bands, like the Misfits, are, like, so baked into their DNA, it's undeniable. They might not sound like them, they might not look exactly like them, but, like, the vibe and the spirit is definitely there. Like, I actually just got a new book that came out called Scream With Me, and it's basically a coffee table book of Misfits art. And it's one of those things to me where, I don't want to say that the Misfits are, like, relegated to being a coffee table book, but, like, I don't know, man. Like,
Yeah,
this book the book kind of stands on its own when I look through it, in a way that like it doesn't even need the music. Like you look
no.
through it and you think to yourself like, wow, this is like this kind of iconography and this kind of aesthetic is like it's so it's so entrenched in like where like a lot of popular music and subcultural music at this point that it doesn't really matter if people are listening to the records because the influence is like so obviously there.
Yeah, and that's interesting. We didn't really talk about their influence on the iconography and look of punk, but they deserve more credit for that as
For
well.
sure.
But you're right, and here's where I stand on it: is the fact that they have something like a coffee table book, which, by the way, at least two mutual friends of ours contributed to that book, so we'll talk about that off air. But is the fact that there's a coffee table book about them that's really beautiful and well done, and anyone who enjoys them, you should run, don't walk, and get that now. But and then even you throw on these reunions, and I wonder if that relegates them a bit into this world of well, they're not an active band and they're not releasing current music, so they're relying on a bit of a legacy thing. And I always wonder about how, in the long and short of it, younger people who, let's be honest, punk music for the most part is aimed at these feelings of aggression and anxiety and angst. They strike some chords with teens and people in their younger years. Not to say that they don't hit me and you in our mid to late 30s the same, but still, I wonder about how that, being a legacy act, interplays with the idea of aiming at young people. For most people who, what is the average age of someone who attends Riot Fest, for example, which is a big annual festival that went on for a few years. They had at least one or two they were doing in Denver and Chicago, and I think they did a couple other locations as well. I know they've done Philadelphia. I think they did Southern California somewhere. But right. What would you estimate? And this is purely blind, but I would put the average age around 25.
Oh, that's interesting. I was thinking older.
Oh, see, there you go.
I was thinking late 30s.
Oh, see, and that is the question. If it's late 30s, then my assumption is that it's people who are familiar with the band, and I could be wrong. But that is where I start to wonder about the relevance or vitality of an artist, because the age starts to factor in. Yeah. That said, to me, Walk Among Us is absolutely timeless. The energy jumps off the page, and a 38-year-old can like this as much as a 17-year-old today, tomorrow, and hopefully to the end of time. But I don't know. It's very. I don't think they're a gateway band in the same way as they were for people 20 years ago. For the last 10 years, I'd say they're probably about the same. I think they're not the first door you walk through. They're later.
Yeah.
That sounds right. I think you go back to this when My Chemical Romance. My Chemical Romance was a very, very popular band. And you talk about them or a band like something like Fall Out Boy. There's probably a step in between there. It's like, oh, I discovered My Chemical Romance, and then something in between. And then I got to the Misfits and other bands, quote unquote, like that. And I think there was a point where you were discovering bands like Black Flag or The Descendants or Minor Threat through the Misfits, and they may now be in the same bucket with those bands in the discovery process.
Yeah, and I mean, I also wonder how much, being that their logo and everything is so iconic, I wonder how much that hurts them at this point. Like maybe people are reluctant to check them out because it's so obvious.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just more of a question, but
I agree. I think there's probably people out there who've heard the Misfits name and maybe heard a song or two, but never really gave it a deep dive. That's a good. we should probably start wrapping things up, but I did want to ask, because we talked about the iconography a little bit. If you were to look at the cover of this record, would you know what it sounds like? And it's a little hard because you have to almost divorce yourself from knowing this record for going on 30 years.
That's why it's tough.
So
what I know what it sounds like. I think that divorcing myself from it, no. Because at this point, you know, there's a store called Hot Topic that I'm sure everyone's aware of. It's in every mall in America. You know, the aesthetic was, you know, more or less like co-opted by Hot Topic. So like in that way, you know, I don't know. It could sound like My Chemical Romance for all I know. It could sound like anything. It could be some sort of throwback, you know, cover art where they're trying to, you know, like there's spaceships and, you know, all these different things. I don't know. I mean, I think at this point, like looking at the cover art itself, it would be really hard to tell.
I agree. I do think I will say that it evokes something weird and eerie.
For sure.
So you have the band members on the cover. You have this odd looking bat spider creature. And you have Walk Among Us in a really plain font that's, again, when I look at this record cover, there's 8 different elements that I'm pulling apart and going, they have this high contrast photo. They have these layers of different things. The colors are really unique. They're using this purple green color combination that, and they, you know, there's been different pressings with pink and what have you, but the purple green is what I think of. And those are colors typically associated with these odd and foreign things. The Misfits logo itself is kind of a weird looking thing. I wouldn't know what it sounds like, but I know it's weird.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes sense.
If there's a kid, you know, that's, you know, new to all this stuff, seeing this album cover, I don't know. I mean, you look at pictures of The Cure, you look at pictures of Typo Negative, you look at pictures of, you know, Sisters of Mercy, you know, I mean, all these bands, like in different iterations, they kind of look very similar, right? So like this could be like some synthy throwback. It could be, you know, horror influenced. Like I'm just trying to put myself in the perspective of someone seeing it now with fresh eyes. I don't know.
Yeah, you know what?
Directions for me.
When you say that, it also makes me think too. The Misfits, because of our background, we associate them in this bucket with punk and hardcore, and that's where they belong. That 100% do. But there's also this larger world where you mentioned Sisters of Mercy, The Cure, Typo Negative. Those are all bands with very diverse sounds. However, those were all bands that you could see on the stickers on the bumper stickers of a car, and somebody could have all those bands and a Misfits Crimson Ghost sticker, and it wouldn't be that off-putting or weird. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I wonder about those people, the people whose only true interaction with the more punk world of music, it maybe it hits Ramones, maybe it hits some of the 77 stuff, maybe, but it might just stop at the Misfits. And I kind of think that's a unique and cool place. And what does that say about the rest of the pool, and how unique the Misfit sound is, even in the framework of the where they get categorized and the record section they're put in at the record store, you know?
No, for sure. I mean, kind of last thing on, you know, their influence, but I lived in San Francisco for 5 years, and while I was living there, I every summer I worked at basically like the biggest concert venue around. It was called Shoreline Amphitheater. It was kind of like the big, you know, outdoor arena there. And, you know, that's where Ozfest was held every year. So I worked the Ozfest every year for 4 or 5 years. And, you know, I think at this point, probably most people at least remember Ozfest somewhat. If you're younger, maybe not. But, you know, it was essentially a big, you know, metal festival headed by Ozzy Osbourne.
Right.
You know, a lot of bigger bands. Black Sabbath would play some years. You know, all the big metal bands at the time. It really doesn't matter. Slayer, whoever it was.
Everyone went through Ozfest for sure.
Everyone went through Ozfest. That being said, none of the bands sounded like the Misfits from my recollection, but tons of Misfits shirts,
For sure.
Like their influence was all over the place aesthetically, and people were kind of clinging on and wearing the shirts and this and that, but there definitely wasn't a band there that sounded anything like them. So it's interesting how their influence can kind of translate in these different ways.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and they transcend a genre in such a way that almost it feels like they could be grouped with bands that are so different than them just because of how large their influence is. So,
Right.
Wow. Well, I sort of feel like after this conversation, we should take. Have you ever been to Lodi?
I actually haven't. No, I was thinking.
Me
about
neither.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to go do a road trip up there. When it's yeah. All right. We're gonna pencil it in. As is standard for us on these episodes, do you have a record you want to pick for next time, or do you want it to be a surprise?
This time, let's let it be a surprise.
Okay.
I have some ideas. I have a few directions I think we could go, but yeah, let's hold it for next week.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. You can follow us on all the relevant social media feeds at
It Came From NJ Pod.
And you can email us at
It Came From NJ Pod at gmail.com.
Thanks, everybody. I turned into a Martian.